Okay, everybody out there in YouTube land, it is I, Matt Yancik, and welcome to another episode of Role Player with 1,000 Faces. So each week, or actually, truth be told, not each week, but whenever I get the time to do it, I do like to bring you another cool creator or a writer or an artist or someone out there that's doing something that I find to be personally super interesting and really worthy of being talked about. So before we get to our guest, though, even though you can see him here in the shot, what I'd like to do is just thank everybody out there for the increase in subscribers. I really do appreciate it. I know that I'm a small potato in a big sea of much bigger potatoes, but every subscription to me counts, and I really appreciate that you're watching, and I hope you find my content worthwhile. But you didn't come here for me to advertise the channel. You came here because tonight I have a guest by the name of Rogan Shannon. Rogan is a YouTuber whose channel covers an eclectic mix of topics ranging from talking about his experiences as a member of the deaf and queer communities to his blogging about his views on life and the world around him and whatever else strikes his fancy. So watching his channel, it seems to me that he focuses in a lot on reading a tremendous amount of books and delivering reviews and his thoughts on them. So Rogan is currently working as a freelance deaf interpreter, and he's moving toward becoming fully and formally certified. So I first became aware of Rogan when I stumbled upon his video essay entitled Dungeons and Dragons and the Deaf Community, which unpacked a topic which I'm a little bit embarrassed to say I wasn't really aware of or it really hadn't even occurred to me, which is namely, why does Dungeons and Dragons have an almost non-existent relationship with the deaf community, as Rogan puts it? So without further ado, Rogan, thank you very much for coming on the program, and welcome to Role Player with 1,000 Faces.
Yes, I'm excited to be here. Yeah, and to talk about D&D and the deaf community and myself and whatever else comes up.
Yeah, I'm super glad to have you, and I appreciate you taking the time out to be here on the program. So Rogan, can you maybe can we jump in and could I just ask you, can you tell us a little bit about maybe your background and where you're from and how you grew up and maybe what you're doing now? So I'm kind of looking at your past experiences here. Like, could you have sort of predicted that you would be playing D&D on YouTube with like thousands of followers? Is this how you wanted it all to be?
Sure. So I grew up in Washington State. Lived here my whole life. I still live in Washington State. I live in the city of Seattle now. And I grew up in a really small rural town, sort of north of, have parents who sign. That when you think about accessibility for a deaf people, a lot of times when parents find out, they don't always learn sign, but my parents learned sign right away. I grew up in an environment with interpreters all around and language access, so I was able to survive. And when I grew up, I wanted to become a teacher. That was my goal for a really long time. And I went to college for it. I still wanted to be a teacher when I went to college. But while I was there, I quickly realized that a classroom teacher didn't really make sense for me. I didn't want it. Maybe once in a while, I would want to do a workshop and maybe provide a training or something, or help develop curriculum. But to teach for a full year, that just wasn't right for me. So I decided to change my major. And I wound up making my own major, which I called leadership. And I took a bunch of different classes. It was some business management work, some hospitality work. I took some classes in psychology, a variety of things that all came together to become my leadership major. And at that time, I wanted to work on like campus, on like college campuses, maybe helping out with student organizations and clubs and that kind of thing. So I was getting involved in those things. That was having a really big impact on my experience, and I wanted to be able to continue on with that. So I graduated college, and I went and did another year of studying because I went abroad to Denmark because there was some deaf international program there that I wanted to be involved with that was related to the leadership work I was doing, in college. And so that program, it was a year long. And once I got back from that, I was really struggling to find work, that I couldn't find a job that really fit what I wanted to do and where I was at. Like, there was a lot of work that I've been doing as a student worker, and then there was master's programs, but I was sort of in the middle, that I was no longer a student, but I didn't have a master's. So I decided I wanted to try something different. And that was sort of how I fell into deaf interpreting after that I started to be a volunteer. I volunteered at a deaf-blind camp as an interpreter-ish. And that was where I really had like a major career shift into being a deaf interpreter, which is what I am now.
And so you mentioned that you went to school originally for teaching. Is that what you, like, if we go back and look at little Rogan running around in his backyard, was that what little Rogan wanted to do? Did he want to become a teacher, or was teaching kind of something that came along a little bit later on?
Well, so funnily enough, my parents told me that I wanted to become a teacher as early as age 3.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah,
I always knew I wanted to be, well, I enjoyed working with people in general.
Yeah.
So I would like teach them how to do something if there's like a new skill. And for a long time, I thought that a classroom would be the best way to do that, would be to spread information. So technically I went to school I majored in photography because I wanted to teach film and photography. That was my goal. And I then started thinking about master's education for that. But while I was going through the photography program, a lot of things happened that made me realize that this wasn't the right path for me. So that's why I wound up changing.
Okay, got it. And you first came to my attention because of your interest in role playing, but from what I understand, the role playing is a relatively recent hobby for you. But what were maybe some of your hobbies like growing up, or how did you maybe play when you were a kid?
So in terms of role playing, so like D&D, it's the term for like D&D and RPGs and stuff. That really started for me in like February of 2021. So yeah, it's new for me. But growing up, my family always played a lot of board games, and a few of them had a little bit of role playing involved, like some pieces of it. Or my best friend growing up, we would like make up stories together that we didn't like play video games or watch TV and stuff. We'd go outside and we would play all the time. And really, I mean, we were sort of LARPing. We were basically LARPing as kids. So that was a big part of my upbringing. That was a big part of it. And in elementary school, or maybe like 5th or 6th grade, we had a play, like a theater program, like a 1-week theater program for deaf students in my area, where everyone was deaf, all the actors were deaf. And that was a really like a lot of fun for me. That was where I really started to realize like, oh, I do enjoy taking on a role of putting on another person, being someone else for a little while.
Right.
So I kept going with that for a while. But I wasn't really involved in that in high school and college. But I did continue to go to watch theater and see theater as an audience member and support from behind the stage, behind the scenes work. I took some improv workshops in 2019 too. And I'm also have been involved in a short play festival around a similar time. So all of that really made me realize that, like, oh, I really miss acting as I was
Yeah.
getting involved in that in the late 2010s. And so when I found D&D, I thought maybe this is a good place to sort of exercise that muscle, so to speak.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about childhood in terms of LARPing. Um, I've actually kind of often thought about that myself. I think like when we're younger, we're all LARPing. It's just without like a rule book. We're just sort of LARPing just for fun and all of that. What do you think it was about the performance or the acting or the LARPing, maybe as when we're little kids, we maybe call it LARPing, but as we get older, it becomes more like acting. What was it about it that really interested you, or maybe caught your attention, or liked, or just simply enjoyed so much?
Well, I'm not officially diagnosed, but I'm reasonably sure that I'm like 99% sure that I have ADHD.
Hmm.
So I think that like my mind is constantly making up stories, constantly, always. So that's something that, like, even while I'm
Yeah.
sleeping, I can't, if I can't sleep, it'll be like, okay,
Right.
I'll make up a story, and then I'll pass out making up the story or something like that. So my brain is always making up stories.
Hmm.
And but when I'm like playing in my head is not the same as like actually doing it, right? So by doing it, that really, I don't know, it really triggers some part of my brain that
Hmm.
I can really enjoy. That I could try and I don't know, like, what's it like to be an old man, or like
Right.
a bored teen or something in a candy store, and that's always really fun for me to try and see like how I would put that on, how I would live if I was that character.
Right. And I guess as an English teacher, as some of my viewers know I am, um, I I I noticed that, of course, you're a super like ridiculously prolific reader. You do a tremendous amount of reading books. And were you saying that you make up a lot of stories like in your mind and in your head, but were you reading as a child so prolifically? Were you into stories, I guess, or were you sort of making them up? But did you watch a lot of TV or movies or read comics or?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I actually had almost no interest in movies at all.
Hmm.
Just none. Maybe some like specific films or something I would watch. It's funny, as a deaf person, my maybe my number one favorite movie is Mary Poppins. Yeah, Mary Poppins. I don't know why. And I don't know why I decided that that was going to be my favorite movie, but my nanny from when I was little, who knew some sign, would sign the whole movie for me
Oh, wow.
until the captions became available, until we like found out that it had captions. Before we knew that,
Right.
uh, that and then I also, once I was old enough to start reading for myself, that
Mhm.
was important. But I was like, as soon as I learned how to read, I immediately fell into books. That my family has is really big on reading in general, and most of the people in my family are readers. And so I think that part of why I think about like making up stories is because I have been inspired from all those books that I read. That often the story that I make up would, as I was trying to fall asleep, would be something that I just read or something that I
Mhm.
just watched, or I would
Mhm.
pick that up and then play with it in my head to sort of see like what else I could do with it, what else could happen in that story. So yeah, I've always been a big reader. That's true. Movies, TV shows, I got into them a little bit more later in life, like in high school and college. I started in college for sure. I was actually stopped reading for pleasure in college because my brain was just like couldn't deal. I didn't have the capacity for it, for reading for fun. At least I was already reading so much for school, and so I did watch a lot of TV shows in college because it doesn't require any like mental energy in the same way. And then after
Right.
college, maybe like a year after, I went back to reading for fun.
Oh. It's funny that you say that, because I remember when I was so I'm an English teacher now, so I kind of understand the perspectives of my English teachers back in like high school and college. But I remember when I was I was hoping to take a certain like advanced level course in English, and my English teacher asked me. She looked at me and said, "Well, so do you really like to read?" And I was hoping to impress her by saying, "I love to read. I read all the time." And she said, "Well, this class is not for you." And I was like, "Why not?" And she basically said, "Well, if you want to go to major authors class, you have to set aside all the Stephen King books, and you have to like pick up, like something from Bronte or something from, Mary Shelley or whoever it happened to be." So I kind of identify with what you're saying about not having, like, you're so mentally exhausted reading the stuff that's required that you just want something that will just be poured into your eyeballs, like a movie, like a good movie or a good, like, uh, TV show. So I understand that. And I understand it now as a teacher too, actually. And I say the same to my kids. Um, Let me ask you, you mentioned that you made up your major, leadership. And I was gonna ask you, I was gonna say, well, how do you feel like that's connected to who you are maybe now, or have you carried through with that? But now I feel a little bit like I'm starting to see a little bit of a connection in that, in a weird way, I feel like making up stories is like leadership, because you're leading the story or you're leading the characters, you're deciding the fate of certain people or whatever. But can you tell me, like, what do you think that leadership maybe means to you, maybe now versus maybe when you were making up your major back then? Has it changed at all, or do you feel it's
Yeah, so I don't know if leadership was the best word to even for what I was doing. That I used at the time, because for college called the major, it was like there's an applied arts and science major, and that says nothing about my major, right? Applied arts and sciences.
mm,
So I started calling it leadership because it was the best I could think of at the time.
mm,
But leadership, when a lot of people think about leadership, they think about it as one person in the front,
mm,
or somebody carrying the burden for the group and leading everything on. But often or one thing that I was discussing in my year in Denmark too, when I did that program, which was also about leadership, that the thing that the group discussed there was that really leadership, maybe sometimes it can be one person in the front taking the lead, but more often than not, it's actually a person in the back pushing everyone else forward
mm,
and trying to support people where they need it. And where you don't
mm,
need to be supporting, then you just leave people off to do their thing. You don't need to do anything. So at that time in college, I took that on because I was heavily involved in student clubs and organizations, and I was trying to make my sense of my personal life as like a student as I was going to college, and at my time in school. And I mean, it wasn't very healthy. I didn't have a great balance, but so for now, I think I'm still, yeah, a little bit freezy, so the interpreter missed a moment. But in terms of leadership now, we might be able to find a different word. And I don't know what the word is exactly, but leadership might not be the best match.
mm. Well, then let me ask you this. What was it that initially kind of provided the spark for you to create your own YouTube channel? did you have like a plan in the beginning, or were you like me and you just said, oh, I'm going to reserve a name and I'm going to start sending videos out and we'll see what happens?
Well, I first made the channel in, I think, 2014. And that was because at that time, maybe there were just 2 or 3 people who were like regularly posting at that time on Instagram, and really it was mostly Instagram that I was seeing, which was still just picture focused. There wasn't really any place to do vlog content. And now, of course, things are different. We have TikTok, we have Instagram Live, and there's a lot more. But really, there's been a big explosion in deaf creators now, both on TikTok and on Instagram. But YouTube, especially in 2014, there was almost nothing. So when I decided to make and start my own channel, it was because I wanted to have more deaf representation there, really. And at the beginning, it was just vlogs. It was just like day in the life of me, that kind of thing. And I wasn't really thinking about education until, I don't know, my second year. Yeah, I guess in my first year, in like, it was the end of college for me. So I was approaching the end of my graduation. And I was just trying to create some content to really celebrate that I wanted to recognize the graduation, talk about was my study abroad that was coming. And because my program really, I wound up editing a lot of videos for my study abroad program, and I got really fed up with that. I was just done with editing. I didn't want to have to do that anymore when that program finished. So when I came back, that's when I sort of shifted what I was doing to more educational content rather than vlogging. So talking about the community and the deaf community, the queer community, and everything else that exploded from there. And I wanted to make educational content because that tended to be things that were maybe less visible, or people, or maybe less known, like the history of a specific word, or something that is not that like heavily used or shows up everywhere. So a lot of the stuff that is like very information heavy, or resources that like about the queer community, is not accessible in Sign for the most part. So the history of the queer community, like, that's not in ASL anywhere. So I wanted to make those visual for people who might enjoy that, but maybe don't enjoy reading and want to have access in another way.
Oh, this is interesting, and I'm not sure if I'm going to ask this question correctly. I saw on your channel, and I think from what I understand from what you said just now, that it's not accessible. And as an English teacher, I'm kind of interested in this idea of, so I'm not even sure how to phrase the question exactly, but are you saying that there, and this is kind of maybe a duh question, there are people that prefer to read it in Sign versus reading it on the page?
Yes. So yeah, I was assuming that was what you're going to ask. So a lot of deaf people grow up without access to language, period. No language, because their parents don't learn Sign, and they try to have their kids learn how to speak and listen to spoken English, but often that doesn't work. Like, I can't hear speech. I have hearing aids, and when I use them, I can hear some speech, but I can't understand the words that I'm hearing. I don't make sense of the individual words. I just can't. I don't know why. But even if I could, and I was able to, it would probably require a lot of work on my part, like hours and hours of work, to be able just to understand what a person is saying from the auditory information that I can get. And then you add on a variety of accents, a variety of like regional words and things, and how people talk, the difference between people talking more quietly and loudly and mumbling and stuff, and the variety of ways that people make sense. It's nearly impossible to understand everyone perfectly for me. So some people do have the capacity to become pretty good and use their hearing aids or a cochlear implant effectively, but not every deaf person can. And often deaf kids will not have any language until they are at age 5 or 6. And that's late. That is late for kids to get any language at all. That's a serious problem. So that can cause some really long-term damage for deaf kids and deaf people in general, that they can struggle to understand English. But sign is easier to understand because it's more visual and because it's more clear than trying to just listen through whatever devices they have. Because when you're listening, you're trying to understand what people are saying, but you're not trying to understand the meaning behind it. You're working to just get access to the words. So when you're signing, it tends to let people have a little bit more ability to just sort of go for the meaning rather than just trying to understand word.
Oh, that's so interesting. So then what would a sign version of something be? Would it be a video in which someone signs through the text, or would it be something else?
Yes. So there's been a long discussion about this, but the best equivalent to writing is probably video. If you're thinking about a written form of sign or something, that video is maybe the best equivalent that we have for someone signing, because there are people who try to make sign writing systems, but it's really tough because sign language really in America, but also all over, has a lot of facial expressions involved. And if you don't use facial expressions, then you can't have a complete understanding of what's being signed, that it's grammatical and part of the language. So it's really hard to figure out how to write down sign because there's so many elements that are involved. But so video, yeah, is the best equivalent that we have.
Interesting. That's like just that's super interesting to me. Like, just so I am obviously, as I've mentioned a million times on my channel, an English teacher, and I'm actually kind of a hobbyist in languages. And it's so fascinating to me to discover that there's a whole other aspect of language out there that just, it's completely like invisible to me and had not even occurred to me, actually, as a matter of fact. So can you tell me then, so you didn't necessarily start the channel with the intent of educating, but it's pretty obvious from going through the channel that you've become like a real advocate and an educator. I mean, if nothing else, you've definitely educated me about a lot of stuff that I wasn't, aware of before. So if that wasn't the original intention, what do you feel like maybe you got out of the channel originally and get out of it now? And what do you think your viewers are getting out of the channel?
I think even from the beginning, I had some intent of educating, but not necessarily like, okay, I'm going to talk about this topic today and give you a lecture. Blah, 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 blah. Here's all the details, and I'm going to teach. That wasn't the goal. But I was originally sort of more casually trying to just have some more visibility as a deaf person. That was my goal. I just wanted to get people used to seeing that. So I think that there was always some intent of educating from the beginning, although it was in a different way. And for my viewers from the channel, that I hope that they're able to get a look into what like a deaf person's life might look like in the deaf experience. Because often, like, parents of deaf children, when they learn that their kid is deaf, they will look at the kid and be like, okay, my dream for my kid, my goals for my kid are all destroyed. They can't hear. Everything's ruined. And I don't think that's necessary. I want to be able to talk about how that can change and some other approaches there. And so I might show that just because you can't hear, that doesn't mean that it's over, that I can be an example of that. And that's, from the beginning, I was initially thinking about making videos more for people who don't know anything, who could be able to like see a deaf person figure out like, what do they do? What? Oh, they're just like us. Okay, interesting. And then it sort of evolved into more teaching about specific topics and more in-depth discussions, because people started asking me, oh, I want to know more about this part of your life, or I want to know more about this, and things like that. And I was happy to do it. So I started evolving in that way.
What got you so interested about in doing reviewing books and the graphic novels and things like that? Because to read them, I guess, is one thing, and to get joy out of reading them. But I think just from being a YouTuber for like a year and a half or 2 years now, I know there's definitely sometimes different kinds of joys and different frustrations about conveying that then through your channel. What do you enjoy about doing about the reading and then conveying that to, you know, your thoughts on it to the subscribers, to your viewers?
Yeah. So I enjoy reading books, and because I get to experience a lot of different perspectives, because I experience a lot of books that maybe are not about people who share my identity. And I also get some about people who do, but it gives me a perspective into how some experiences work for experiences that I've never had myself. And I really appreciate, it's very beneficial for me just as a person in general, because it helps me to understand how to maybe communicate with other people who are different than me, either in my personal life or as an interpreter in my work. And it helps me understand how to interpret things better too, because that is a big part of reading, is exposing you to a variety of perspectives. And then in terms of sharing my thoughts, I started doing my like monthly roundup of books, because I was just talking with a lot of deaf people who don't have access to English, as we were just talking about, or maybe have limited language access. And it was because of that that really impacted that. Like, honestly, not a lot of deaf people read, because it's seen as work. I will read only if I have to, because I have to do it in school, and a lot of kids are really frustrated. Okay, I'll read this because it's for homework or things like that. And I understand that perspective, but I wanted to try and just provide some representation of like, hey, look, here's a deaf person who's reading for fun. Reading can be fun if you pick the right stories, if you find a story that you enjoy. Because, like, I mean, science fiction is not for everyone, right? I love it. I'm a big fan, but it's not for everyone. And that's fine. So it just means that you have to find your own niche and something that fits you and your own preferred kind of story. So I read all sorts of things. I read everything as much as I can because of that.
I definitely noticed that.
Yeah, right. So, and then when I get to talk about my own thoughts, it can help people look, and maybe they could see like, oh, that story seems interesting to me. That's up my alley. Or maybe I'll try to read that one. So for like a specific book, maybe like a queer book or something like that, those can be more special, because those I make sure to, well, I try to look at them from a more analytical perspective or a more critical perspective. I can do a critique, because sometimes some books I'm like, this is awful representation, and you need to be aware of this. Like don't read it, or if you read it, be critical. And like, if you're going to read it, just know that this is not a good representation of whatever that identity is, or something like that. So I've read some stories about deaf characters, and some of them are just, it's just like the writer's hearing, and they don't have an understanding, or they don't have experience of working with deaf people or communicating. And if you don't have that, then you can't write a deaf story, because you don't understand the depth of our experience. And so, yeah, that I think about like writing identities that are not your own. It's a problematic topic. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's actually something which, you know, it's interesting the way that in the last 5, 10, 15 something years, this has become an important issue, and something that people are talking about is representation in general. The amount of people on spectrums in all different parts of life, like whether it be, your sexuality or your background or your color or your gender or anything like that. Like it's so interesting. And the idea of really taking the time to try to understand that, and also the idea that certain, maybe people should be telling certain stories, and maybe other people might not, it might not be appropriate for them to be telling that story, or if they do, then they need to really think and research and kind of understand and check and double check and triple check. What makes for you, like, what makes a good book then? Like when you sit down and let's say you're not even going to review it or anything. Let's just say that you're on an island where you have no access to YouTube, and you are given access to like a couple cool books. What's something that maybe you read and enjoyed, and doesn't even have to be like that you've reviewed? Oh no, I've stumped you.
Yeah, can you clarify the question for me? I just want to make sure that I understand the question.
Yeah. So is there a particular book that you've read recently, maybe that you've really enjoyed, or and what is it about maybe that book that you enjoyed, or what makes a great read for you?
Okay. It's a hard one. I read so much. So for me, in general, when I'm given a book, like I give a book a 5-star rating, I say it's the best. That's because I feel really immersed in the world that's been built. That for me, world building in general is very important, because if it's only plot, but I don't know what's the surroundings look like, it feels it could happen anywhere. And but if you take the time to really, like, even if it's just basic, like simple world building or something, like, okay, this is in like the world in a small hamlet long ago, that gives me more of a sense and more of a picture of like, okay, what's the time, what's the context, what could happen to these characters in their everyday lives and things like that. Because the story, like, plot's great, but outside of it, like, I want to feel like there's something happening that could like impact their decision making in the world. And for me, world building is just paramount. If you have like a deep world, that's the ideal. That's the number one for me. So there's one author that I think is really good at that, is Becky Chambers. She's a science fiction author, and her series starts with The Long Road to a Small The Long Road to a Small Angry Plant. I think that's the title. Interpreter's clarifying. Yeah. Oh, Small Angry Planet. The Long Road to a Small Angry Planet. So that's the first book in the series, but the whole series, it can stand alone. So the series, each book can stand alone. You don't have to read them in order. You don't have to read all of them, but they all have some connections. The first book built the world, and I already felt immersed in it. And then every time I read it, and I read another book, I felt immersed again immediately, in a different part of the world still, but it was just amazing. That's one of the best for me.
I feel like I was about to ask another question, but I feel like you've kind of answered it, but I'll ask it anyway. What is it that you enjoy about role playing, and maybe what got you initially interested in role play or role playing in general?
So I've always seen references in pop culture, like, or just like little weird things off of the side about like, oh, the games that people play would always show up in movies and shows and things like that. I had always seen mention, but I never really thought to actually take a look at like D&D and what it is. But I saw a video from a YouTuber that I really enjoyed. It was Nerd Sync, that YouTube channel, and they made a video about their basic D&D journey, the basics of that, from how they went from knowing nothing to how they started learning and found like a group to play with and so on, and then they really fell into it. So I watched that video, and the message of it, it was like, there's a TV show that I watched, which is Dimension 20, which I really started watching that on YouTube, and I was addicted after that. I fell in, changed my life. It's my life now. I'm obsessed. So I really enjoyed that because I was able to see the people make up the story live in real time.
Yeah.
It was an actual play. There was no written script. There was no going back to edit it. It was, no, they had to make their decisions in the moment. And then once it was made, you couldn't go back. It was stuck. And that really like led to some crazy hijinks and things going haywire in the world. So that was fantastic for me. So when I decided to start playing myself, I really enjoyed making up the stories on the fly, doing improv. And so I was able to find people that I knew, that I happened to know, that like, hey, how would you feel about like, I'm making a new campaign, do you want to join? And I found a couple people who were able to join in. And from the beginning, I already had like a gut instinct that I would be the game master or DM, whichever you want to call it. I had a gut instinct that because I enjoyed making stories, that I felt like I would maybe enjoy being a DM or GM. I want to make stories. So yeah, that's how I fell in.
I would just like to take this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to say, if you're interested in Dimension 20, I do have an interview with Rick Perry from a few weeks ago. Please smash that like and subscribe button. Anyway, back to the interview. So I think I know already. So it's a daunting task to sit down and you just started GMing. What was it like to sort of sit down and, I mean, are you really making it up as you go, or were you like planning stuff out months in advance? What was it like to be a first-time game master?
Yeah, well, the first time I was a GM, I had 4 players. One of them was experienced. The other 3 were completely new. And they were all good friends of mine. And I'd contacted all of them and been like, are you interested in D&D? And the reason why I picked the 4 of them was because they all share an interest in in Studio Ghibli. So I already knew that I wanted to do like a longer campaign inspired by Studio Ghibli, like their movies. So I specifically picked those 4 because I knew that they were interested in the film, and I knew that they would be like aware of the kind of world that I wanted to do. So one of my friends, who was one of the new players, and so we had the 4 of us, and we came together and we started to experiment. And of course, the experimentation, and we had chemistry, excuse me, this is the interpreter clarifying, that we had a lot of chemistry together from the get-go, and that's obviously very important. And so for like the basics in our first session, I knew that I had some sense of what I wanted the world to look like. I had a list of a few key characters, like the hotel keeper I knew was going to show up, and maybe an assistant and girl in the community or whatever. I had some basic notes about who was going to show up. I think I maybe had 7 NPCs ready on a sheet because I knew that they were all going to come up. I had a plan. I was going to use them, and I had them ready to go. They would be helpful in my story. But beyond that, it was full improv that we were just making it up. I did make, I had like a basic map of the town, like a geographical place of places they could go visit. And I had some picture of that one of like where you could go, where you're going. And I did make a map for combat. I made one combat map that I'd made ahead of time. I borrowed it from some other map that was drawn, and then I edited it a little bit to fit what I wanted, to make it a little bit simpler and a better match for my stuff. So I did that work ahead of time. And it was because I knew I wanted to be able to, like, it was a place I knew I wanted to sort of force them to get to because
Right.
I had it ready. So that was my one goal. I had one railroad. That's it. But so it was really just a one shot, not really a full campaign. But I kept it very simple, very basic, easy for first time players. And also the three of them who were first time players, they had no previous knowledge of D&D except for like what it is basically, but they never watched Dimension 20, they never watched anything. So it was very from scratch in what we started from nothing and went from there. So yeah, so that was my setup. It was really simple. I really, for both them and for me, we all, as a first experience, I really enjoyed it. It definitely was a lot of improv, and not really like planned and structured that much.
Do you feel like watching Dimension 20 or other actual plays, do you feel like because my kind of perspective is that I often hire teachers, and sometimes I have teachers that have never been up in front of a real classroom before. And of course, there's always that first time for everyone. But it's not like you can go on YouTube and watch like actual teaches of anyone out there. Do you feel like it gave you an advantage in slipping into a game master role, or did you feel like that sort of imposter syndrome, or did you, or maybe was there a lot of pressure because you're thinking, oh my goodness, I'm not just learning up here, I'm kind of faking it until I make it, and I have to help these new players too. Like, was there some, or did you just forget about all that and you're like, I'm going to have some laughs tonight?
I think watching D20 was definitely a big part of it for me. I mean, to be honest, I never read the Player's Handbook. I never read the Dungeon Master's Guide. I still haven't read them, sorry to admit. I'm sure I will in the future. I just to see what's there. But all of my knowledge right now really comes from actual play, and mostly from D20. That's most of what I watch. I've seen some of Critical Role. I've seen their one shots. I've seen all the one shots they've done, and their most recent Exandria Unlimited, that universe stuff. I've watched those, and those definitely influenced my style as a DM too, for sure. And I'm definitely very flexible as a DM. That I'm not a rule focused person. I'm not a rules lawyer. I will be, of course, like in some situations I might raise an eyebrow, but I'll always do a yes and, that I try and follow that improv rule. But I will say yes and there will be consequences for failure or things like that, basically. So if you want to try this, you want to do something totally out there, sure, but it will be very hard for you to do that or something like that. So I definitely don't really worry about like any of the specific rules. Oh no, we've broken one thing. It's more that, and also want to like, if people want to test what they can and can't do, I'm open to that too. And we're all sort of trying to figure out together, like, is there a way to do what you want to do? Or like, okay, that thing you just suggested is too much, and then maybe I'll step in. So, but I'm very flexible with the rules myself.
Yeah, I think to be perfectly honest, like as maybe again, this is my teaching perspective, but I don't really feel it's necessary to sit down and read through an entire player's handbook. And definitely, I hate to say it, but maybe not really I was going to say the teacher's manual, the Dungeon Master's Guide, either. Like, I feel like they do offer tips, but the Dungeon Master's Guide is kind of geared more towards like, how do you run a table? How do you interact with people? And I think that that's helpful for some people, but I think that for other people, maybe you might already have practiced these skills or know these skills. What do you feel like makes a good dungeon master or a good game master? what were you trying to sort of, I know you mentioned that Dimension 20 influenced you in other actual plays, but what were those one or two of those things that you were sort of like, okay, I got to work on this, that, and the other thing? Like, what makes a good DM to you?
Okay. Well, to become a good GM, let me think. It's a good question. I think I want to be a good DM or GM. It means that I want to be able to do what the players want. That I want to, like, that's really the number one for me. That in terms of my setup for any campaign, I just want to be able to sit down with the players beforehand, and maybe I might have an idea for running a campaign and what to do with that. But if the players don't really have interest in the thing that I came up with, then it won't be fun for them. It won't be fun for anyone. It won't be fun for me, because I'll be trying to push them into a story that they don't have any interest in. And it goes the other way too, that if the players really want to do something, but I'm not really interested in their story
Right.
or their concept, then that'll be really hard for me to like give them a good story and a good experience and give them what they want. Because sometimes I feel that, like, as a DM and as a player, you have to have a good relationship together. And so sometimes it needs to happen before you even start playing. You need to be able to sit down and just figure out, okay, what do each of you want to get out of this game? What's your goal for the campaign or something like that? And I think that's something that can be revisited as you go on. If it's a longer term campaign, then you can like sit down once in a while and say, like, I think for me, that I need to be more aware of, okay, are my players enjoying this? If not, then what can I do to make it more fun, make it a more fun experience for them? Or maybe even like have one-on-one moments with them, like, hey, I noticed that you're not really like, you don't seem to really be having a good time. You're not really enjoying it. So what can I do to change? Like, what do you want? Where do you want me to take the story? Where do you want to change to a new character if you're not enjoying what you're currently doing? Something like that sort of thing. And I think that, or thinking about like how somebody might want to change their character, if maybe they need to just go away for a little bit. Do you want me to kill your character? Or something like that we could have a discussion with the players and keep that relationship going. I think that makes it a more fun experience for everyone.
And so you're saying that the first campaign though lasted for about a year, you said? Oh wow. I'm actually really impressed that
it's a little weird that I technically DM'd 2 campaigns right now.
Yeah.
And they both are on hold for months. It's really hard to make it work because of people. Some people started new jobs, some people moved, yada yada, life. That's very common in D&D, common D&D story, as you know.
Yes.
Yeah. So the 2 campaigns that I have right now, the first one is been going for, it's really a continuous one shot that was like the first game that we started. And that world that I talked about before, we've kept the same world just because, why not? And then we started a second campaign that's been going on for a while, which I love it. But we needed to take a break from that one because it's a little bit more in depth. It's a little bit more, there's a lot more politics and intrigue and trying to solve a mystery, figure out what's happening and stuff like that. So we took a break on that to just go back to the first one in that world that we can do a little bit more like basic stuff, very like, every day going, you have one goal, it can be a little bit more one-shotty, more simple as opposed to like the grand overarching thing. And so we've continued that for another few sessions, and it's also on hold, and we might go back to the politics and intrigue. We go back and forth between those 2 campaigns. It's the same group of players for both.
Right. It's interesting that you kind of say that, because for me, I've had kind of a similar experience. Like there was a point where I did I've done many campaigns, and there's a point, like a certain point after 20, 30 episodes, I need to just take a break and go do something different. And I've kind of switched recently to doing one-shots, a lot of one-shots with my friends. And the issue that I'm having now is that I'm just doing a lot of one-shots and I miss the depth of a campaign where I don't have to rush everything in one episode. I don't have to worry about awkwardly saying, well, we couldn't finish tonight, so can we play again in one more week? Like, because with a campaign, people expect to play every week or two. Do you have a preference for, I mean, it sounds like you like them both in different ways, but do you have a preference for like a campaign versus one shots, or?
I think they each have their own benefits. What I like about one shots is that you can, if you plan appropriately, and you can do it in one day. That's
Yeah.
that you have some story, you can have some story, some combat, and do it all in a session, and then you're done. With a campaign, you might have 2 sessions that are all role playing. That's it. There's no combat at all. And then you might have 1 session that's just all combat the whole time. And you can have that sort of variety in that. So for the one shot, or for one of the campaigns that I'm doing, we have sort of this series of one shots in the world. So we'll finish a one shot, and then, okay, do you want to go back to that world again? Okay, we'll add another one shot in the same world, the same characters or something. That could sort of continue from something that we've done before. It creates a little bit of a chain. So that can become a little bit more of a longer campaign in that way, in that sort of like form of one shots, and I like that.
Yeah, it's so funny what you're saying. I feel like you're doing the same thing I'm doing, because like I started in my most recent world that we've been sort of playing in. I started as just doing a bunch of one shots, and then at a certain point we were one shotting every couple of weeks, which is kind of where we are right now. And it's almost like, why don't I just do a campaign? And what am I one shotting for? Like at a certain point, because obviously I like the world. I guess my players like the world because we keep coming back to it. So why not just make it kind of extended? How did you create your world? Or are you blending a little bit of like the Forgotten Realms D&D world, or are you just completely creating from whole cloth your own setting?
So the answer is different for the 2 different campaigns that I'm running. I'll tell you what I call it. So one of them, the first campaign is called Stormvale. All is one word, Stormvale. And the second campaign is called Hibana, Hibana. It's a Japanese word. It basically is like fire flower. So Hibana, that is the Studio Ghibli inspired world. That it's kind of my own creation, but it is based on things that could happen in like a Studio Ghibli film. So it's a little bit more, it has some limitations around it. It has to sort of fit that style. And we all sort of have some sense of the setting of how things are going to work, a concept of maybe there's war or that kind of thing that's going on in those worlds. For Stormvale, it's completely improv. It's totally made up. It's not based on any films or anything, but it's very high fantasy. More like you're in forests, there's elves, that kind of thing. More classic D&D. And it's interesting because the first one shot that I ran there in Stormvale, it was full homebrew that I didn't really plan, but I happened to like leave an open ending to that. When I wrapped up that one shot, there was like one clue at the end that I left that I didn't really have an answer for it. But then later my players like wanted to know, we took a break, and they were like, so
right
at the end, you never give us the answer. So maybe we need to go back to that. So when I kept going, I kept using that. I found some modules, some already made, pre-made modules that I could use. And I think the module I used, it was called The Last Pilgrimage. and I can't remember who made it. I'll have to look at the name, and I can send it to you if you want to add it in the description or something like that. But that module that I did really helped set up like some Japanese feel of the world. I don't know. So that sort of mixed in with what the Stormveil already had, and it became again a little bit of an overlap with the Japanese themes that had been going with. And that module, I struggled to use it a little bit because some things in it, my players would ask me like, "Oh, can I go there?" And I was like, in my own homebrew, yeah, I would say, yeah, sure, go, no problem. But because now I'm using a module, first I have to check the module. Is it there? Is what you're going to do going to break the thing that I have on my sheet? So it felt kind of limiting. So after that, it was the first time I used a module. The second time I said, it's not flexible enough. I just want to let people tell me what you want to do, and we do it. And if we break it, then I'll figure it out. We'll work around it later when the consequences come up. And then after we finished with that second module, I was like, great, I'm not going to use modules anymore.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I have had like the same experience. Like my friends might come to me, or players might come to me and say, "Oh, I want to really play this module," or whatever. Or I would think to myself, "I want to play this module." And then when I start running it, it's so hard, because then when I'm in the game, I have a tendency to just sort of make things up. And if I make something up that contradicts something that's going to happen in 5 episodes, and I understand the modules usually say at the beginning, they say, read this whole thing first and understand it. But I don't have the time to read like a 200-page, even 100-page like module. So like I end up like just frustrating myself and I sort of toss it out the window. So I do understand like that feeling of getting frustrated with a module, but I have to admit, sometimes when I'm tired or I'm just like, I can't, I'll just grab like a scene out of something and transplant it into like whatever world I'm using.
Yeah, the module that I used, that Final Journey one, I had to modify it a lot anyway, because when I first, like, my friend sent it to me, is like, "Oh, this looks really cool and stuff. It's very simple." I read through it, and it is simple, but I think it was just like 3 pages or something, 3 or 4 pages.
Oh yeah.
So it's very simple, and it can be like done in 1 to 4 sessions or something. I think, like, if you really like move it along. But we didn't want to be. We had like 2 like 4-hour sessions or something. We went off on our own little side adventures and stuff. Off the point. So that module was really designed for level 5 players, level 5 characters. And my players were level 2 at the beginning, because it was a world we'd already been using. And so then I was trying to modify it anyway to try and like reduce the challenge rating of people, get it slower. And so I was already modifying a lot. And then that other thing that, like, if you're using a module, it'll be a lot easier to find like something to match your player level and things like that. But because the players already did like a good job at like cleaning up, going through the module, I still like had it set at level 3 or maybe level 4 or something like that. It was hard to figure out how to like really like match the players to the module that I had. And then I did make sure that I wanted things to be balanced. So we had when we had players at level 5, I went to that module and I was like worried, and I had a friend come help with like, okay, now there's higher level things to deal with. Hang on, I lost my point. Because of that, we were able to finish the module without anyone dying. So so that's good. And I had to do 2 levels up to get them through it or something. But
I totally know what you mean about the balance stuff too. That's something that I sort of struggle with. Naturally, I think if I really wanted to, I could sit down and really figure out like the way that the monsters are balanced and how many monsters I should use and how often it should happen and whether I should level them up. But I'm a little too lazy for that. Or maybe okay, maybe lazy is not the right word, but I'm more into the story than I am battling the monsters. So like for me, I just, for me, to be honest, when I have my choice, I actually go with, I don't know if you've heard of it, but I use Monty Cook's cipher system. And I don't mean this to be like turned into an advertisement, because people that watch my channel know that I talk about it all the time. But I highly recommend it, because it kind of addresses some of the things that you're saying. So you're talking about how you have to match all the levels and stuff. And, when I'm making up a story, the last thing I feel like doing is worrying about the monster levels. Like, I just want to worry about giving them a good story. And what I like about Cipher System is that it's basically got 10 levels, and you rate the monster or the creature or the NPC on 10 levels. And you have a general idea very quickly of what it can and can't do. So yeah, now Monty Cook's going to give me $1 because I just mentioned it. No, he doesn't really. Not really. Sorry. I wish. Monty, you can give me $1, but I'd accept it. Patreon. So anyway, have you thought of writing all this down? Are you writing this down? It would be like, how do you feel like about your setting just sort of existing like an ice sculpture and then disappearing?
Well, that's one thing that I'm trying to do, but I really struggle to figure out how to best codify it, because our first one shot that we did, the first game that I played, I recorded it. I used I used QuickTime Player to just do a screen recording, and I borrowed a laptop from a friend and I recorded on there while I was running the game. So I have a record of that, and it worked great. But I'm still trying to figure out how to really get like a 4-hour video uploaded somewhere, or uploaded and like maybe sent somewhere. And then because we play on Zoom, at least we did for the first session, and then on and on. Well, like some we played in Zoom, but I kept like failing to record it, or something would go wrong. And that's one, and this is a place where accessibility is important. That it's a big difference in how hearing people play D&D compared to how deaf people might play D&D.
Yeah.
For us as deaf people, we need to be able to record the whole screen the whole time. That like, if you share screen, we need to be able to see the share screen, plus we need to see the DM and all the players.
Right.
And hearing people can just like record audio and that'll be fine, right? You can get it all. And so that's been frustrating for me with Zoom, because if something that I learned after is that if I record, I touch record on Zoom, and then I share screen during the recording, it will record only the screen that's being shared. It won't record any of the videos of the people who are there. And so I saw that happen. I was like, I wish I knew that beforehand, because then I would have figured out another way to sort of keep the people there while I was recording. So that was really frustrating for me. And I couldn't figure out, like, we lost some of it. We lost some of the recording because of those challenges. And there was no point of like keeping a recording that was like just the map for an hour.
Right. Well, you mentioned, and sort of circling back to the original thing that caught my attention, and when I noticed your YouTube presence, you had mentioned how you didn't feel, or you had said that D&D had a non-existent relationship with the deaf community. And I think I better understand what you mean now. But could you tell me what should a healthy relationship between D&D or RPGs and the deaf community kind of look like? What would that be?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with what I said before, which is that deaf people don't always have access to English, right? So if they learn it later in life, so often deaf people who want to play D&D might like, are they going to read the DM's guide or the player's handbook? They'll take one look at it. They'll see the really dense text. Even if they're really skilled in English, English still might not be their first language. So it might be totally overwhelming for a lot of people, and they'll just say no and go away. Or another way that people like might learn how I do is they would watch actual play, right? But right now that I know of, I only know of 2 actual play shows that happen regularly and will regularly have captions, and it's D20 and Critical Role. And those are the only 2 that I'm aware of. That's it. The other actual play shows don't have captions, or they are audio only, they're podcasts. And so that's obviously not accessible for deaf people. And I know some that will have like transcripts available that are like typed up of whatever they're saying, which is fine. But with a transcript, you're losing so much information. You're losing a lot of the nuances, you're losing the body language, the facial expressions. And being on camera versus just like sitting there reading it, there's no, like, it's like you're reading a book, and you would have like, she said sad, or like you're missing the adjectives in there that could like add the sort of context of information of the tone and how things were being said. But in the transcript, it's just word of the things that were said. There's no additional descriptions of like what the voices sound like, or what the facial expressions might have been like. So when you just read it, it's boring, right? So for me as a reader, it's boring. I'm like, I don't enjoy reading it at all. So the visibility of D&D in the deaf community is very limited. So I would mention that there is a group called Deaf Board Game, the Deaf Tabletop online convention, the DTGO, Deaf Tabletop Games Online. There it is. And they do some D&D live streams, I think once a week actually, in ASL, and which is great. And I don't watch that often because I don't have time. But one thing that I personally have a hard, again, I have ADHD. I have a hard time sitting down for 3 hours to watch a D&D session. So if I can, I'll like increase the speed to like 1.5 speed, which YouTube can do. And a lot of other streaming services have the ability to increase the speed after it's been streamed. You can then do it. On Facebook, you can't do that. You can't change the speed on Facebook. The videos are locked. So that's, again, frustrating for me to like actually watch the whole thing from this Facebook group that streams D&D. But every week they have D&D with a deaf group of players. The only negative is that there's no captions and there's no voicing. So it's just signing. So it's only accessible by people who know ASL. So yeah, complicated. For D&D in the deaf community and their relationship in general, I think that there's a big fight. For myself as a DM, often when I'm describing things, or like what something looks like, or what's around a character and their surroundings or something, if I were to just speak, I would be describing all the words. I would spend a lot of time. I'd spend a lot of time coming up with like various adjectives and things in English, for example. But in ASL and sign, so I'll give you an example of my opening for like Stormvale. I might say we open. Oh, I'm not sure how to do this with an interpreter voicing for me. Okay, interpreter's going to keep voicing, but I think just know that the English description in the ASL won't match exactly. So think about what you see. So like, if I say in English, you say, we see mountains, we're introduced to Stormvale, there's rivers going through it, there's a dense forest, and there's a boat on the river. You'd be explaining all the different environmental details. But in ASL, I might sign mountains and show them curving down into valleys. I would show what the river looks like and have a boat on top of it. And I'm done in half the time that I did the English. I just paint a visual picture with my hands, and I don't have to use all these words to explain what's happening. I can just represent it in 3D space. The environment just appears in front of me. So for example, when I'm describing combat with sign, you can explain how people are moving with just your hands. So If somebody jumps, you would show it like this, just two fingers jumping off the hand. You could show which direction they're jumping. You don't have to say, I jumped to the top of that rock with all those English words. You can just show, I jump, one sign, and the jump goes to the place where the top of the rock is, and you're done. And if you want to say you do a backflip or something like that, you can just show it again with your hands using 3D space to sort of show how it moves. Again, one sign. And it's more visual than just speaking the English word backflip or things like that and then trying to explain what the words are. You might be building a picture in your head, but you won't necessarily know in English if you have the same picture as other people. But with ASL, you're describing it physically in space. You all have the same understanding. You can see it all together. I think that that's a big missed opportunity to add more visuals. That if you have deaf players in D&D, it would add a lot. That the deaf community loves to tell stories. We love it. We love making up stories. We love telling long jokes. It's really a big part of like any social gathering with deaf people. If you go to a deaf camp, a summer camp, it'll be full of stories. There will always have story time every single night. It's just a normal part. And of course, like at hearing camps, this happens too. But for deaf kids, like a deaf summer camp, it's a really big part of the culture. It's a cultural element of the experience that, like if there's no story time, you won't go to summer camp. It's not actually a deaf camp if there's no story time.
Right. No one wants to go and not hear their stories. So that's it. Let me ask you then, maybe it's a good time. And I feel like, and I sent this question to you before, and I feel like it's a simple question. It seems like a simple question, but I feel like it's actually a more complex question. Like what is sign language then? Like what, I understand that it's people and they're maybe moving their hands, but like it seems like it has its own sort of, for lack of a better word, like grammatical rules and maybe properties and things like that. Can you help me understand what maybe how sign language would differ from spoken language?
Yeah, you're right. It's a simple question with a complicated answer.
Yeah, I was afraid of that.
Right. Well, it's hard to say exactly because sign languages in general have similar structures to each other. But I want to clarify, first of all, that ASL is called American Sign Language for a reason, because it is used here in the US and Canada, and Canada has some of their own regional variation too. But British Sign Language is completely different in the UK. It's not the same language at all. It's not even in the same language family. They don't have the same history. We're actually closer to Old French Sign Language, LSF.
Wow.
And British Sign Language is divergent from that, completely different. So each country really, for the most part, has their own sign languages. Some have some ASL influence because of religion, that some people went and brought sign language there and sort of forced ASL on those communities. That's its own story. But for this conversation, signed languages in general, so with ASL, English and ASL are similar. So English, I'll stick just in this context for now. So in English, the English word car, you might tend to do all of your descriptions. You would say the descriptions first, and then put the word car last. You have a shiny, fast, blue car, right? Adjectives come first, and then the noun at the end. But in ASL, you would often say car first. You would set up what you're thinking about to build a mental picture. And then as soon as you have that, then you would make the car shiny, make it blue, and make it fast. So you put the subject first as opposed to in English, because sign language is very visual. So if you are trying to say like the shiny blue fast car, well, as you say shiny blue, I'm like, what am I thinking about? I can't build a picture in my head. But then maybe you would add shoes at the end. Maybe you could add car at the end. Like, I don't know. So instead, we put the noun first, the subject first. And then we go ahead and do use our hands as stand-ins for the thing itself that we're talking about. So for shoes, for example, I might be talking about shoes, and I could put my hand out like this, a flat hand, like this, to represent the sole of the shoe. And I might say the sole is red, and then I could touch the top of my hand and say that it's white to show that part. I might show the front, like here, and give a different descriptor there. I might show the heel by putting my hand up and going like that. And so my hand becomes the thing itself that I'm trying to describe. So you can't really do that in English, right?
Yeah,
So,
that's amazing.
yeah. So if I'm trying to describe like a white shoe with a red sole and a heel, and that I'm getting a really long English sentence here, but in ASL, I can do it really quickly and show it visually very clearly, very swiftly. So yeah, the structure of the language is different because it's visual. It requires grammatical structure to work differently.
You mentioned the subject coming first, and it's interesting. The first thing I thought of was I had studied Japanese for about 7 years in Tokyo. And it's just interesting to think that the Japanese has a similar structure. You will say something like car. And then once car has been established, you just sort of start talking kind of around the idea of the car. And it's just a given that everyone understands you're talking about the car. And then it's like you're placing words on a table. And then the last thing that you'll say in Japanese is the verb. So what kind of happens is you say, okay, here's a car. There's like a person, and there's like someone driving it. And then, oh, the verb is like pick up or whatever. So suddenly all of those words just sort of come together. So it's interesting to hear that with American Sign Language, the noun, the subject comes first, and then you just sort of lay it on the table, and then you describe it afterward. And that to me also seems kind of French, because in French, you would say, you don't say blue truck, you would say truck blue. So I guess maybe that's part of the roots or whatever, like what you were saying about the resemblance to French.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And the structure of most sign languages is more similar to the Romance languages in general, like Spanish, French, Italian, and all of those, because they have similar structures with the subject first and then everything else coming after. I lived in Denmark for a year, as I mentioned, and I learned some of the language there. I could like write and read Denmark, not enough to like really use myself, but I could get by a little bit. And I learned some Danish sign as well. And Danish sign is closer to Danish writing than ASL is to English writing. So, or it's closer to Danish writing than it is to ASL. So for table, like again, like if I was trying to build a table, that's a great example of like, it's important to set up the subject first so I understand what I'm thinking of. Because you can't, like, yeah, a table is a great metaphor because you need to have a table to put something on it, right? You can't just put something in midair. If you just put a cup out there, what am I putting it on? It's going to fall, right? Where's it going to go?
Yeah.
So you can't put it there if there's no table or chair first. The cupboard, it's like, doesn't make sense. So you set up a table and then you can put a cup on it like this. So there's the table. Table has to be set up first. And then you can show where you put the cup. For a cupboard, I show the cupboard first, and then I show that I put the cup in the cupboard. If I just put my hand up here, like I just did after I signed cupboard, it doesn't make sense without the cupboard to root it. It would be like saying, in English, you might say, like, I put the cup in the cupboard, but that doesn't make sense in ASL because it looks like the cupboard was closed when I put the cup in. So you have to open the cupboard first and then put the cup in, and then you close the cupboard.
Yeah, it sounds like you're looking for the context and the perspective first, and then you sort of move in and get to like the fine details so that you can kind of set the broad picture maybe first. So kind of generally.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And I think that works with D&D too. It's connected, that you have to set up the big picture, you have to set up the world, and then you narrow in.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking as well, because I feel like there's nothing, like we're just playing with our imagination. There's no forest, there's no castle, there's no whatever. So I've always kind of said that like setting up a scene in D&D or an RPG is kind of like an inverted pyramid. the game master's interaction with the players is like an inverted pyramid. You set all the things out on the table first, and then you sort of step back slowly as the players start to take over, and their pyramid is like a regular pyramid and mine is inverted, or the DM's is inverted. So it's really, it's so funny that you say that. I was about to say the exact same thing. I think maybe stories are kind of like that too, because sometimes, because they often start out very broad and you describe like a broad scene, then you move in. But when they go the other way, they're going for like a certain effect, and they're using the effect of a bird is sitting on a branch, and then we pull back and there's snow on the branch, and then we pull back and there's a snowy field, and then we pull back and the sun is shining, and like there's this back and forth,
right.
which kind of was going to lead me to my next question, which is, you had also mentioned that sign language was also uniquely suited in some ways for role playing. Can you talk about what some of those ways are, and where like sign language excels with RPGs?
So one big part of most sign languages around the world, it's a word that we use in ASL, but I would apply it to a lot of other sign languages. The word is role shifting. Role shifting.
Yes, you'd mentioned that.
So this is where, so if I'm telling a story, and like any story, not necessarily D&D, in regular ASL conversation, I would become all of the characters in the story. So if the story has two people, I'm one and then there's someone else, I would role shift to help set up who's speaking without having to say the name of the person every time. He said, she said. Mm. So if I'm speaking in English, you might have to say like, oh, well, Wally said this, and then this other friend said this, and use their names to sort of keep track of who's talking, and it adds a lot more words, right? But in signing, you just have to shift a little bit. You would set up at the beginning, when I'm leaning to this side, I'm this character, when I'm leaning to this side, I'm myself. And then you just have to rotate your shoulders and sign. You don't have to add, now this person's saying, now this person's saying. You just set it up, and then it becomes clear. And then you shift your shoulders, and now it's clear that you're the other person. So it's just a little shift. And that becomes really clear about who's speaking without having to repeat over and over who's actually speaking every time. So this is a really benefit in D&D, because as a DM, I have to play everyone, right? So
yeah.
So if I happen to have two NPCs in a scene who are there having a conversation with each other, I can just do that. I can just shift my shoulders back and forth in my chair really simply. And of course, I will add little things like there might be a hunch on one of the characters. There could be characterizations. There'd be facial expressions that might be specific to that character and their tone. But the things that most DMs do, it requires them to really identify who the character is, right? So as a DM, I might have a shoulder up to be the hunch, and every time I do that character, I will always have this, and I'll still sign, and another character might always have their shoulders down or be a little bit more posh or whatever. And that's a big part of ASL too, the sort of body language and the facial expressions and the changes that you might do in your shoulder and posture. It's like even in like any story outside of D&D, if I lean up, I look like a taller character. If I lean down, I could look more shy. If I change anything about me, it could change the whole feel of the person who I'm showing. And that's a huge benefit for storytelling, and especially for D&D, because it depends so much on, well, at least from what I've seen, it often relies a lot on voices, right? Voice work, voiceover, tone, but not so much on body language for hearing people and facial expressions, which I think can make a really, really big difference in a game of D&D. Like in D20, there's some specific players who are very expressive in their face, and they really become their character, and less of themselves. And that really helps me know when they have like their voice on, right? When they're doing their character voice, even if I can't get it through my ears. So yeah.
It's really interesting. Again, I feel like a parallel between with Japanese, because the shortcuts that you kind of mention are ones that I experienced overseas. So for example, in English, when I want to say when I want to say there's an apple on the table, and then I make another sentence, I have to say I ate it or I ate the apple. So I'm kind of repeating the concept of the apple again and again and again through multiple sentences, because spoken English needs and requires like a subject every time. But the shortcuts that you talk about remind me so much of Japanese, in that once I say the apple, I never have to mention the apple again. And in the language, a Japanese speaker takes it for granted that you're talking about the apple. So, for example, if I say there's an apple on the table, my next sentence can be 8. And that's a full sentence. It's just 8. Because what else would you have eaten? Because you've already set up the apple. And I can say delicious.
Yeah. Yeah. That sentence is exactly the same in ASL. Apple on the table, eat.
Oh, wow. My mind is blown. I need a moment. That's so cool. It's really interesting. And yeah, sometimes, like you said, I would listen to a conversation and it's so quick because a Japanese person may use one single word and then react with one single word and then another single word. And I'm totally lost, but the context is all set up on the tables in their heads. And I haven't had, 40 years of getting used to it. I've had like 6 or 7 years of stumbling through it and trying. But it's so much, it's so fascinating, so interesting to me.
Yeah, I just want to add just another thing with sign, that one kind of storytelling that we have in the deaf community we really enjoy is doing a back and forth, that you might like have a concept that you might set up in space, like for example an apple, and then like maybe you would set up in space and then I take a bite and somebody else might grab that mimed apple from me and do something else with it, and maybe they would throw it to someone else and someone else might catch it, and we can really have that sort of interplay already built into the language. We have the capacity to play with things that we've set up in space for storytelling purposes. We can pass things back and forth. We can do whatever we want with things that are already there because we already understand what the setup is. We have the visual clear in our head. So maybe with like a sword, for example, if I pull out a sword, I might sign sword like this. It's really clear what I'm doing, right? And then it's in my hand now. I can then use my hand to stab. I could react to something else that someone else has happened. I could slice like this, but people will understand what I'm doing if I just move my hand like this because I've already set up that there's a sword in it. So that it adds more like drama and acting into the storytelling instead of just like speaking everything and having to add so many words.
Does a person's way of signing like say, like, are there different tones or voices that people will use when they're signing that you can kind of like distinguish and feel the differences between?
Oh yes, for sure. There's regional accents, the same as there is with spoken English, that we sometimes joke and say that because you have like a sign accent, we wouldn't sign accent. We'd say you have a signed accent when we're pointing to the Adam's apple area, but we actually might sign it on the wrist because we're like, oh, you don't have an accent at the throat, you have an accent on your hands, right? So that's
yeah.
When we're talking about local variants of signed accents. We're really across the US, things are pretty similar, just like spoken language in like the Northeast and the South, and the West, there's some variation. But I would say that maybe it's less obvious accents than for spoken language and like spoken English accents. Individual signers definitely have their own voices, so to speak, that they like. For people in general, slowing it down for this interview a little bit, but in general, I'm a very fast signer. So people ask me on YouTube, my YouTube videos, to slow down, and I'm like, nope, I can't. You touch and change the speed on YouTube. It's right there for you, but I'm going to stick with my own thing. So sometimes I have to remind myself to slow down for the interpreter and things like that. If I'm doing a presentation, also, I will force myself to slow down in general so the interpreters can catch up and stay on me. But I'm a fast signer, and that's just part of how I am. And people who are very slow, there are people out there who take their time with their signs, and that's just it's just how they speak. It's the same as with people who use their voices to communicate. It's the same. You have varieties of ways of expressing yourself.
People tell me, because I teach, I've taken my teacher's voice from outside, from the classroom to the outside. And a lot of people kind of get irritated and annoyed with me because they'll look at me and just go, you don't have to speak so slowly. And they don't understand, like, I do have to speak slowly, like for myself. Like I need a pause. And I need to enjoy the quiet of that pause. And I need to like then start like build up like something quickly as I climb the mountain of verbally. And then I run down it. Like I feel like, yeah, in a way, like people get irritated because I'm kind of maybe the opposite of a fast of a fast speaker. You had mentioned that you speak very fast. You sign very fast. But you'd also, I'd seen on your website that you're a deaf interpreter. And now I was wondering if you could tell me what a deaf interpreter does, and would you have to do it very fast in order to keep up with someone else? Or can you explain a little bit about what your work is like?
Sure. So I'll explain a little bit about what a deaf interpreter is first. So there is a lot of different ways that interpreters can work in general. There's a lot of different paths for interpreting. A deaf interpreter tends to be more specifically focused on working with hearing teams. Not always, but often they're teamed with a hearing interpreter because, well, hearing interpreters tend to learn sign in schools, which is fine. It's where most people learn language, but they tend to learn in schools. But because of that, their sign, there's an interpreter accent, basically. It's really easy to see that you can see an interpreter, you can know from their signing style that they are an interpreter because it's not their first language. And how they learned is very academic in a way, so to speak, that they learned in a classroom environment. But when you go out into the real world, into the community, there's such a variety of ways that people sign. Some people have very strong ASL with no English influence whatsoever in their sign, in their language structure at all. And then there's a range of people who maybe grew up with an oral education, they grew up speaking, they learned sign maybe not at all, or they learned sign later in life. And their sign might be on a different spectrum of having more English influence. So hearing interpreters sometimes will struggle to understand people all across that range because they learned in this very specific environment of a classroom without access to the whole range of ways that people communicate in the deaf community. So you might have a deaf interpreter brought in to help work with the hearing team. So the hearing interpreter can hear and sign what they are hearing, but the deaf interpreter can watch, take what they're putting out into sign, and then interpret it into something that's maybe more ASL, or maybe it doesn't need ASL at all. Maybe the interpreter will sign ASL, and it might need to turn into something more gestural for someone with limited language, or use of more visual pictures, if that's what that person needs. Maybe the person didn't get any language at all, including sign language, until later in life, or they're from another country. Maybe they know another sign language, but not ASL. So a deaf interpreter will have to adapt to try and figure out how to communicate, relying on ASL to get to what the deaf person needs. Deaf people also already have some internal ability to code switch for situations that we know how we grew up. We had to figure out how to communicate with lots of other people. And we can take that experience that we have from growing up and apply it to working with our teams, that we can figure out like, okay, what are you understanding? And then how might I explain that concept to someone else? So there's a lot of different ways that deaf interpreters can work. And some deaf interpreters will work only in like platform interpreting on stage. They might work on the news, like press announcements, press releases, politics, that sort of thing. for like a wide audience. And some people will work only with, I don't know, people from other countries. They might work with deaf immigrants. There's a range. I tend to specialize with people who are deaf-blind. I do deaf-blind interpreting. Most of my clients are deaf and blind. And I prefer that because you get to sit close to the client, because maybe some people might be low vision and can't see from far away. Maybe you need to be exactly 5 feet away and just sign everything and it'll be fine. They might have low peripheral vision because they can't look around and catch everything. So they can it's better if they can just focus on one person. Sometimes I might be doing what's called tactile interpreting or pro-tactile. It's really, tactile interpreting is just signing ASL with somebody having their hands on my hands. So if I'm signing, they might put their hand over mine and they would be able to feel my signs while I'm going. And then there's another thing called pro-tactile, which is itself a language. That is a fully touch-based language. That it has some ASL involved, sort of language that's borrowed from ASL. It's derived a little bit from ASL, but it uses the body beyond the hands. It has different ways of conveying information. So like one basic example of that, like if I'm talking about, I went fishing last week and I caught a fish that was this big or something. With a deaf-blind person, either if I was doing tactile ASL or pro-tactile, I would be doing it with one hand. I wouldn't be using both hands to show that. So I would have to be signing the fish was this big. I wouldn't, because if I sign the other hand, they only have one hand over mine, so they'd miss the information. Big. In pro-tactile instead, I might use their body to show how big it is. I might like run my hand up their arm. So wow. The fish. So, or I could do it on the thigh if we're sitting down next to each other. There's a lot of varieties of that, and I could talk about that for a really long time. There's lots of linguistics things to go into there that I won't get into right now. But that's one of the jobs that a deaf interpreter can do. So really, there's a variety of things. For me, as an interpreter, yes, I talk fast, but it depends on the situation. So for some of my clients, they might prefer that I just get the information and just throw it to them. Don't interpret it. Don't mess with it. Tell me exactly what they said. I want to know that. Don't mess with it. Don't play with it at all. Just give me word. And that is just as fast as I possibly can, because I'm trying to keep up with whatever's being fed to me. And so I can get that to the person. And when that happens, I don't remember what happened after. My brain is just like in a mechanical motion. I can't retain any of the information. I'm just funneling it through me. But some clients would prefer that I use pro-tactile, and that requires a lot more thinking and processing to translate it. So I would often like wait, get some information until I got a concept. Okay, now I understand what we're talking about, I might say. And then if I was like working with a hearing teammate, for example, I would tend to ask the interpreter to give me more English, because then I can figure out what we need to keep and what we need to get rid of. Like what might be a good fit for pro-tactile and what might not. Interesting. Sometimes I'm sort of watching and I'm like, what are they talking about? I can't figure it out. Like for the end with a shiny car or something like that, like it might take me a while till we get to the car at the end. It's like, okay, that's what I need to do first, right? So it's helpful for me to sort of get the English so I can sift through it myself, find the car, and then turn that into pro-tactile. So that's my work. It really depends on what I'm doing in terms of how fast or the kind of work that I'm doing.
I was wondering, so since I found your channel and since I've been watching a lot of your stuff, and I tend to sort of reflect. I often reflect on the stuff that I watch, and I maybe again it's a teacher in me. I reflect on it like out in life and out in the world. And I was reflecting on my knowledge of anything about being deaf or being hard of hearing or interacting with people in the deaf community. And it sort of occurred to me that, like, I understand that we'll say things like the hearing community or the Dungeons and Dragons community or the deaf community or whatever community, but it's sort of, I was sort of thinking about this as I'm like looking around Starbucks, and I'm like, in a way, we're all a community, like in a way. And I was just sort of thinking to myself, even though I feel that that's true, like as a teacher, that we're all part of like the same community, but we have our different ways. I don't know like anything about interacting or helping to ease the communication, or are there things I should know about, as a hearing person, what should I know about being deaf and the deaf community? And if I bump into someone on the street or wherever, at Starbucks or whatever, what should I be aware of that I unfortunately don't know? What should I know?
So first, in general, deaf people want to be left alone. But depending, I mean, how would you feel if just like a random person that did not speak your language came up to you and was like, "Oh my God," and just tried to talk to you, but they didn't speak English. You don't know who they are. You've never met them before. It would just be weird, right? It'd be like, "Why are you trying to talk to me?" So in general, if you see a deaf person, great, let them go. In situations, if you like actually happen to like have a deaf person come up to you and you start to interact, ask them how they prefer to communicate. We grow up with having to figure out our own preferences. And for most people, they have at least, a lot of people can use a phone to text. They just pull out the Notes app and start typing back and forth. That's easy. You probably have that on your phone. For most people, it's not always true. There's some people who might prefer to just gesture and try and communicate that way. It might take longer, but if that's what works best for them, then follow that. Yeah. And yeah, I would say that.
How do you feel then about the effect that role-playing games might have, or how the deaf community and the RPG community like affect each other? Do you feel like do you feel that your interest in role-playing games has changed you in some way, or it affects the way that you think now when you sort of go out into the world at all? Do you think that the two of them affect each other in any way, the deaf community and the role-playing community, and the way they've interacted? They change the way you think about or see the world at all?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. For me personally, role playing, it's definitely given me a way to be more creative without having to literally create like a physical thing. That I can be creative and tell a story, but I don't have to worry about how is that going to become a printed published thing? Like, how's it going to become a work thing? It's more just making a story. And more generally speaking, I think games bring people together. That role-playing games, RPGs, they require people to work together. And it's a really good skill to build together. That for some people who, I don't know, maybe they're shy, or maybe they're trying to work on building more confidence or more authority and the ability to speak up, then this can provide a lot of, it sort of forces you to, like, without going into like a real life situation, RPGs is like a safe space for you to work on that somewhere else. And so while you're in that space, you can sort of take on a character that maybe is different from you, or maybe similar to you if you want to have something to work on. And that can be a big part of community building too. You really get connected with the people at your table, and you can build really strong relationships while doing RPG. And there are some situations where like if there's something that like you're trying to work on, and like you really have to work on it together at the table, and like things aren't working out. But in terms of like how the deaf community could influence the RPG community, Ooh, well, yeah, as we've been talking about, there's lots of different ways of expressing, of storytelling, of acting, becoming the characters more, which is baked into our language. It's not just using voices, because I know some people aren't comfortable with speaking in different voices because it's just like not their thing, right? It's sort of just not built into what they do. But if you're like able to act it out instead, that could be a really big difference. Like, I mean, even if you're using the same voice, but you have different acting for different characters, that like adds a perspective. So the RPG community, and the deaf community really, yeah, I think they can work together really nicely.
You mentioned that you'd love to see more deaf role players out there, but you also acknowledge that even in the hearing community, it's hard. Everybody knows this. It's hard to. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are. It's really hard to find like GMs and DMs to like run games. And I think if we could find them, we'd have more players out there. How can we find or create more deaf role players?
Well, I think it's challenging because I know several friends who have said, "Oh yeah, I'd be interested in playing," and I'm like, "Great, I wouldn't mind doing that. I'll do something." But I already have 2 campaigns that I'm running myself, so if
Yeah.
I did anything with some other players or something, it would probably just have to be a one-shot, right? I can't do a long campaign. But at the same time, I feel it's not fair to like only do a one-shot, because like, oh, they would love to do more and I would love to do more, but just trying to figure out what's next. But on the other hand, if there's more one-shots and there's more people in those circles who feel like, oh, I really enjoyed this, I could do more of this, then they could have the experience of playing themselves, and then they wouldn't feel as like intimidated by being a DM or a GM. Just having more of those one-shot experiences could help expose them. And I think that that's where a lot of people feel stuck, because maybe they've never played before and they're like, oh, I can't GM, I've never played before. But you can. Don't worry so much about the rules, is my main advice. And a lot of people would prefer to play first and then maybe GM after.
Yeah.
That's another way.
Yeah. Well, how would you like to see the role playing community kind of evolve and change in the future, whether that be about more deaf players or anything else in the role playing community? What would you like to see going forward in the role playing community?
Well, one thing I'd really like to see change is just more opportunities for deaf people to join um, in other games, because like right now, I know of no visible deaf role players in any actual play campaign or module or anything. Like I don't see them online. There's Dimension 20, there's Critical Role, any of the big name platforms, they're all hearing, right? They're all able-bodied as well. There's no disabilities there that I see. There are disabled people involved. I'm being a little hyperbolic, but in the big name games, I don't see them. So some of that I think is because the actual plays sort of started with their core group, right? And then they just stuck with it, which is totally fine. I understand and respect that. But when those big sort of things start to like veer off or have their one-shots and their short campaigns that they're running, that would be a great opportunity to bring in some people with different identities and different backgrounds. Because I mean, like, the big name actual play shows are very white, first of all. They're very white. So I think those are opportunities to have like more people who are not white involved, people who are not straight, people who are not able-bodied. And I think that the role-playing community needs to become a little bit better about supporting people like that, people of marginalized identities. And I know that there are some, I don't know, like some places that are working on that for sure. Like D20, I think D20, Dimension 20 is doing a fantastic job with their side quests, side campaigns, I forget what they call it, but those groups are not that are not the main players. And those, they've already brought in a lot of diversity in those groups, which I think is really great. And I want to see that continue and continue to branch out and I want to see it in other places as well.
Is there something that I can do as a hearing person or the hearing community can do to help support and kind of bring out and foster the deaf community and, on the role-playing scene?
I mean, it's a big question. So you could provide interpreters at various events, like role-playing events, like with RP and also in general, just like having more sign language access in places. Because hearing people often say like, oh, deaf people don't come. Why would we have an interpreter? But the deaf people don't come because you didn't provide an interpreter. So we can ask, we can put in a request, right? But often when we go through that process of requesting an interpreter, we first get told that there's no budget. Then we get told we don't know how to find an interpreter, and on and on. So it's a lot of excuses is what we run into about why there's not interpreters in various places. But really, it's not that hard. In most states, you can just Google sign language interpreter agency and it'll be right there. And you can contact them, find the resources there. You can get yourself an interpreter. And yes, the budget, I understand. But for many specific events, like maybe a community event or something, like some night, like a role-playing night at a bar or something, at a game store, or wherever things are happening, often there are interpreters who'd be willing to do it pro bono, like people in the community who like going to those events, who play D&D. And if they know the people, there's other people who will want to get paid, but the local community might have events set up who with interpreters are like, I'm willing to do this for free, or I'm willing to do this for a reduced rate, discounted, because this is important. So there are people who are willing to do that sort of thing, who can interpret, but you just have to ask. And so I think that'd be the first step.
Right. Well, let me kind of ask you this. You've been very generous with your time, and I think I'm going to try and sneak in one or two more questions to wrap up here.
Totally.
In general, from watching your channel, from talking to you now, I really get the feeling that you have a great deal of empathy for the people around you. First of all, I mean, and I think I have a good nose for it. Like as a teacher, I think I can kind of spot these things. I'm so used to classifying children all the time. But would you agree with that? And I mean, if so, where do you think this comes from, and how can we have more of it out there? Particularly now in the US.
Wow. It's hard for me to say. I know that people talk about how people can learn empathy and stuff like that. But for me, I grew up in a small rural town. And because of that, I was surrounded by a lot of diverse people with a lot of different identities. And because of that upbringing and the way my parents raised me, I was always told you're not special. Yeah, you might have, yes, you have disabilities, yes, you have this, but so what? Everyone, maybe it's not that it's not you're not special to diminish you, but or anything with your personal life, but it's more everybody has their own problems, everyone has their own story,
right?
And it's not like the oppression Olympics of people would say, oh, but I grew up poor, but and it was okay, but you grew up with experiences and your experiences are valid, but what are you doing now? And so the other person's experiences are valid too in any given situation. So I don't know, that's part of why I read so much too, is because I want to read to understand and see the experiences of people who are completely different from me. Like, if I read a book with a Black character, their upbringing and their background will be completely different than mine. And I have privilege as a white person, and I'm able to think about that when I read the book. And I do have a lot of privilege in a lot of areas that I don't realize. Like, I'm also lack privilege in other areas, like I'm disabled for sure. And maybe in the future, I also like, as I identify as queer, that also affects me in some situations, but I still have privilege and I have to be very aware of that. And so that's really important for me, and sort of how I approach my own empathy is sort of recognizing what I have and what other people have.
The other thing I was very impressed by with you on your channel is how open you are about. I mean, I imagine that like every YouTube creator, there's a secret side to you, but you're open about many of the things which are considered to be like, so for example, just gender, sexuality, and whatnot, which are things that are very much considered still, unfortunately, like very taboo to even like discuss, but it's changing. What advice do you have for someone that wants to open up about anything? Not just say gender or sexuality, but just anything in general, and maybe is a little nervous or very afraid to do so. Because it's, to me, I think it's an incredibly confident thing that I see in particularly in a YouTube creator, to just be very open about things that other people like might call them out on or put them down for. And you're able to do so not just in real life, but in YouTube life where you're broadcasting it to people. If you were to talk to someone who was shy or afraid to express themselves, whether it be about their sexuality or playing a game or a belief or whatever, what would you say to encourage or advise them to be more open about that?
So part of why I'm so open is because I know people struggle to be open. And by seeing what other people are who are the same as them, I feel like it could be helpful for them to have models in their life. And so my advice would be to find someone who you know who has that feeling or that experience in common with you, or just someone you can talk together with, that maybe somebody who you're just interested in, or you could open up with or talk with them. And you don't have to tell them anything about you, but just talk with them, ask them some questions. Like, do you mind if I ask you about your experience about how you are so open, or how you talk about this or something? And maybe that could become a safe person to tell in the future. When you tell someone, it could be easier for it to be them. Yeah.
All right. And last question. Is there anything coming up in your future? Anything like you got planned, or something exciting or cool, or what's the next step for Rogan?
So, well, one of the things that I've been thinking about is I really need to update that D&D video, actually, because that video that I made it a year and a half ago. It's a little old. It's almost 2 years old now. So I need to make a new one to sort of update that. So I'll be doing that soon. And hopefully I can figure out, I have some problems with recording. I want to record the D&D game I've been playing, the Stormveil stuff. So I'm trying to edit that. So I do have, I also have another very big, exciting project that I can't really talk about yet, but I can give you the basics. Okay, I'll give you the basics. I'll give you some. So it's D&D related. So I'm going to be doing a one-shot with a group of really cool, really amazing people, and I'm really excited about it. It should be announced publicly. Like, the marketing will happen next week, I think. In the next 2 weeks at least. So there'll be more information soon. I'm very excited about that, though.
Okay. Well, I am excited too. So for those of you kind of watching at home right now, which it's live for us, but it will be recorded for you, I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in to watch Role Player with 1,000 Faces. Thank you very much for your subscriptions and your praise, and anytime you feel like sharing, it's a wonderful thing. It helps the channel grow. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But most of all, I'd like to thank Rogan for coming on the program. I've been watching your channel for a few months now, and when I found it, I just knew I wanted to talk to you. It's been a great experience for me, and it's been a great learning experience. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. And I also, of course, I want to thank our interpreter, Mark Weissglass, who's also been very generous with his time. From what I understand, it's a very, and I think I can see it in him. It's a very exhausting process to translate like that, and I don't want him. I'm worried he's going to like fall over in a second. So I don't want him to struggle any longer. But for all of you watching at home, again, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Please think about hitting the like and the subscribe button, or sharing a cool interview of mine if you've seen them. I'm not doing this for the fame and fortune. Pretty obviously, I'm doing it because I like to bring cool people to you, and also selfish reasons. I like to talk to cool people. So for all of you out there, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a really great game. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next episode of Role Player with 1,000 Faces. So good night, everybody.
Bye.